Hey guys, jumping right in here. I recorded a big long video and I decided to put a TLDR at the beginning because it's kind of a lot of info and it's maybe goes over a lot of people's heads. So I'm just testing the new CTP of Rage, the mighty one. The TLDR, it's good. It's not incredible, especially at high stages of content, but it's not nearly as bad as other people are saying. Bosses seem to have some crit damage, some crit defense system, and ABX, it's not that high, but in high stages of World Boss Legend, it's seemingly very high. So if you want to know how I came to these conclusions, keep watching the video. If you're a nerd, keep watching the video. Otherwise, you can walk away now knowing that CTP of Rage, the Enrage proc in ABX, should give you approximately 60 to 70% increased damage with a 160 Enrage proc, which is what I have. Well, thanks guys for watching if you're leaving now. Otherwise, the stats are coming up now. Hey guys, in the midst of all of the new CTP of Rage, the Mighty and the Brilliant, all the controversy going on, there was some interesting stuff that I saw about crit defense, basically, from World Boss Legend or ABX. So I took it upon myself to do some in-depth testing. I could have used bigger sample sizes, but to be honest, I was a little bit lazy. So I thought I would go over my findings. Flashbang warning, it's light mode, so here we go. Alright, so first off here, you can see I did 4 tests. I did one with Blue Marvel. He's capped crit damage, and I just chose him somewhat randomly because he could be used in ABX today. Yeah, so I did 1 test for ABX, 1 test for World Boss Legend, stage 2 of Null. And I did the same with Black Bolt, 1 in ABX and 1 in World Boss Legend, stage 2 of Null. Difference being, Blue Marvel has a CTP of Destruction, so it's basically the same as not having any CTP or any custom gear at all, except for when it procs, but it doesn't really matter because I did this testing with auto attacks. And Black Bolt has a mighty CTP of Rage with the 160% in Rage on it. And I'll put all those stats up on the screen in a second here. I'll just put the stats pages from each of them on there. An interesting thing I was thinking about is that I have 10% Pierce on my cards, and it does seem from my testing that there is some amount of crit defense, and I'm wondering if Pierce maybe affects that. But I'm not entirely sure at the moment. I didn't really do enough testing on that because I've only had 10% Pierce and I don't really have a good way to change it. I suppose I could use a new card deck that they just introduced, but too lazy for that. So let's dive in. Blue Marvel I used somewhat as a control for this test. And as you can see here are just some of the numbers I had. These were all auto attack based, so with your ISO 8 set procced, it's 40% increase attacks. Something interesting to note that I didn't really realize before is that it looks like that 40% is multiplicative damage, basically. So you're seeing average 95k for a crit hit without my ISO 8 set procced, and with I had 136k, so it's right around that 40% mark, which is not something I assumed. I always assumed that the all attack from the ISO 8 set would be additive with all attack from your cards or from leadership and stuff, but it seems as if it's multiplicative, which is pretty crazy. So it's basically just 40% more damage whenever it's procced, which is I guess I wasn't thinking enough about my ISO 8 procs. That out of the way, we'll dive into it. The method of testing, I was just auto attacking on ABX, the Frost Beast, and then in the World Boss Legend part here, I was just auto attacking Null. So we can dive into the quote-unquote control test of this. So for ABX, on my non-crit hits with my ISO 8 set proc, I averaged 74,708. On crits, I averaged 136k, 379. Here are the ranges, which is the difference between the smallest and the biggest number. And here's the percentage. So it would be 96% to 105% is like a rough average of what it would be. So your average hit is 74k, almost 75. You can expect the roll range to be between 96 and 105%, and that's relatively consistent. It's like plus or minus 10% seems to be around the average from all my testing. See the range here for a crit with ISO 8 is 104 to 92. So nothing too crazy here. Range is 16,000. So with your ISO 8 set procced, the average increase of, or the average percent of damage from a crit was 182%, which does not mean it's 182% increased. It means that it's 82% increased. So basically, if you did 100 damage on a normal crit or a normal hit, on a crit hit in this scenario, you should be expecting to do 182.55%. And without ISO 8 set, there is a difference here. This shouldn't really be different, so I'm not really sure why it is, but it is. So here we're looking at 173%, 173.5-ish% from a crit. And then if you average these two together, you get 178% roughly. So it's not exactly what I expected. We can talk more about that in a second. And here's just some extra random numbers because it was a destruction. Once every 7 seconds, you can crit one auto attack. So there were some fun crits in here. Some extra numbers out of all of these hits. These are the ones that were on proc. And it's not really important. It's just kind of interesting to look at. So with ISO 8 up on proc was 414,000 was my only hit. And it's basically exactly on what you'd expect it to be. It should be 3 times this average, and it about is. It's not exact, but it's close enough. And the same goes for without ISO 8. We're looking at my only non-crit was 150k just about, and as you're seeing here, non-crit's about 55, so it's about exactly 3 times. So this is actually very, the real data, not that there's a lot of it, but it's very close to the expected data for this, which is good. Alright, I'll save this part for after we look at the World Boss Legend section. My method of testing was exactly the same, and let's just dive straight into the data down here. These are the averages. We're looking at non-crit hit, 21k, average crit, 28k. These ranges are about the same, but you'll notice they're tighter now. We're looking at a 2% plus or minus for the non-crits. For the crits, we're looking at like 2.6 over to 3.31 under. So these ranges are a lot tighter on World Boss Legend than they are on ABX, probably because there's a smaller increase in crit damage, which we'll see in just a second here. Yeah, and here I did, just for fun, the percent of damage from 200% damage proc, like I said, should be about 3 times, so 300%. Here it's 2.98, 3.07, so the numbers are pretty spot on with what we would expect, which is good to know, that at least this part of the game is not whack and stupid, basically. Alright, so if we compare this number, the average of the average percent of damage from a crit, which sounds complicated, but basically all it means is that if you crit, you should be expecting to do 30% more than if you didn't, which is a lot less than what I would be expecting, because we didn't really know about this before this. So let's dive in here. I'll go back to the ABX tab. This green section here is what I assumed, or what everybody probably assumed, was how crits worked. Basically, my blue marble has 200% crit damage. My assumed percent of damage from a crit would be 300%. Because in most games, when I read 200% crit damage, it does not mean the hit does 200% damage of a normal hit. It means it does 200% increased damage of a normal hit. Does it go over your head? It's fine. It's not really important. Basically, with 200% crit damage, I assumed you'd be doing 3 times damage. The actual number we observed in ABX was 178. So basically, your crit damage, if you take your crit damage and you multiply it by 89% or 0.89, that is according to this test, that is the real increase in damage you'll see. So instead of getting 200%, we're only getting 178%. This alternate assumed percent was the other way I guess it could have been, and turns out is correct, most likely. So if you have 200% crit damage, you are not dealing 3 times damage, but instead 2 times damage, which is whatever. So 89% is the ratio of the assumed to the actual. And we'll go over to World Boss Legend. So in World Boss Legend, I now know that this is essentially what the game means. If the opponent has quote-unquote 0 crit defense and you have 200% crit damage, you should be expecting to deal 2 times damage. In World Boss Legend, we are dealing 31% increased damage according to this test. So you take your crit damage, you multiply it by 0.66, you should come out with the actual number, which is a bit disappointing, but it is what it is. Now we'll jump into the more exciting stuff, which is the Mighty Rage testing. Alright, and you see we have a lot more numbers here. So, well, this is all this testing. There's a lot more different like states you can be in. So like no rage proc, but you do have ISO and you do have enrage, and then you'll see there's just a bunch of different sections in here. But we'll just go down to the summaries because that's the important part. So here we're looking at the averages of the average percent damage increase. So it's 173 in ABX without the proc, and on proc is 180%. And I observed this in ABX and World Boss Legend, and the way that I can explain this is that on a rage proc there is a 60% decrease of boss defenses, which kind of like this is really reinforcing the fact that they must have like a crit defense stat that is getting lowered by the CTP of rage effect as well. So this is 180 on proc. You can expect to be getting 180%, or just like an 80% increase of damage when you crit. And off proc we're looking at 173, which is pretty close to Blue Marvel, considering that we actually do not have 200% crit damage on my Black Bolt. I'm only at 187, so the ratio here is 93%, which is pretty close to the 89 from Blue Marvel. And then here are the enrage section. So when you have the enrage buff up on the CTP of rage, the mighty or brilliant, you can expect to be doing 290% of the original damage, or an increase of 190%. And on proc with enrage we have 193. And keep in mind this is with a 160% enrage. I should just put that 160% enrage, mighty rage. There you go. Oops. Mighty rage. Alright, so if we scroll, let's jump into World Boss Legend first. So in World Boss Legend, off proc, we're doing 131.37% damage on a crit. Other words, 31% increased damage. And you'll notice that this is like exactly basically the same as Blue Marvel. It's, how close is it? It's 0.2% off. The difference is when we proc the rage, you'll see a much bigger jump in your crit damage here, versus in ABX, it only jumped 7%. But in World Boss Legend, where we have learned they have much higher crit defense, the rage proc reduces it from the 60% reduced boss defenses, and we're looking at a 13% jump here. On enrage off proc, we have 185%, or an 85% increase. On enrage on proc, we're looking at 209%, which is almost a 110% increase in damage. And now we will jump into the exciting part down here, which is really the final results, or like, yeah, we'll call this the final results. Okay, so this green section down here, this is the assumed damage, but if we look here, this number here, the actual increase, is the big money. This is the actual increase, is the amount of damage you are getting from the enrage proc alone. So this is a difference that you'll be expecting to see between a normal rage and a mighty, or a mighty rage or a brilliant rage. Keep in mind that these aren't like actually the increases, these are the percent of damage. So if you're doing 161% of the original damage, it is not 160% increase, it's 61% increase. So with a 160 in rage proc on my CTP of rage, off proc in ABX, I'm seeing a 61% increase. On proc in ABX, I'm seeing a 69% damage increase, which is not exactly as much as we expected to see, but it's close, because 160% crit damage sounds like a lot, But you have to remember that crit damage is additive. So when you say 160% increased crit damage, you're not actually looking at 160% increased damage. The assumed increase would have been 186%. So without any crit defense, we would have expected this number. The increase in damage you get from a Mighty Rage would be 86% increase, and we're seeing a 61% increase. So it's not quite as bad as people are thinking. They just didn't really think about the fact that it's additive. So, and we're going down here. This is on proc, so we're even reducing the defenses of the boss a little bit more. The crit defense specifically, this is for ABX, keep in mind. We are looking at 186, again, was the expected increase. And the actual increase we got is 69% increased damage. Nice. So in ABX specifically, this is a pretty big increase, to be fair. Before you hit 7 million and the boss fences kick in, I don't know how that affects us, to be honest. I didn't test it. But before 7 million, if you're doing 70% increased damage, that's a good amount of damage increase. And the same goes for World Boss Legend. I didn't test this on higher stages, but at low stages of null, we're looking at an actual increase of 30% damage from just the Enrage proc. And on Rage proc with Enrage, we're looking at a 45% increase in damage from the Enrage proc, which is, you know, it's not the most incredible thing of all time, but it's also not terrible, considering this is a 160% Enrage, and it could go up to 200 on a Brilliant. It goes to, I think, 300 or something absurd like that. Yeah, but so my final conclusions will be there is definitely a crit defense stat that bosses seem to have. ABX has not that much. We're looking at like 15% reduction in crits, basically, roughly. Or without an Enrage, we're looking at only like a 7 to 3% when you have a Rage procced, a 3% reduction in your crits, which is really not that shabby. But when you get into the harder content, even on really low stages like World Boss Legend, we're looking at 30% decreases basically across the board. And with Enrage procs on, we're looking at 40 or 50% of your crit damage is getting taken away by their crit defense stat. Final conclusions. The Mighty Rages are better than people think they are. Maybe they're not using them correctly. Maybe they're using them in harder content. I didn't get a chance to test this in ABL. But in World Boss Legend Stage 2, and especially in ABX where the defense seems particularly low, you should be expecting to see a decent increase in your total output here. Like 60 or 70%. Pretty solid. Do I think you should go out and reforge all your Rages? Probably not. They're really, really expensive because they're still probably the best overall CTP. The most used one, I would say, at the very least. Yeah, I will post this whole spreadsheet somewhere, probably in a Reddit post or something. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. I'll try to figure them out for you. Or if you notice a flaw in my testing, because I'm not an expert or anything, but I think I did a pretty solid job.